You may be seated. So I need to tell you right at the get-go that my Uncle Stuart was not a communist. Uncle Stuart was a man of business. He worked for a tractor-trailer wheel manufacturer. He managed a lumber yard. Eventually he became vice president of a bank. When he died unexpectedly at the age of 50, he was giving away the Walton family's money as director of their foundation. Now, I tell you all this not because you should care about my late uncle's resume, but so you won't get the wrong idea when I tell you that he's also the guy who taught me the rest of Woody Guthrie's "This Land Is Your Land." Maybe you know the song. It's that one about the redwood forests and the Gulf Stream waters, the sparkling sands and all that, the one about this land being made for you and me. I mean, what's not to like, right? Well, after the wheat fields waving and the dust clouds rolling part, Woody Guthrie actually wrote a few more other verses that the stern and warbling Mrs. Speaks never taught us in third grade music. One of them went like this: "In the shadow of the steeple, I saw my people. By the relief office, I seen my people. As they stood there hungry, I stood there asking, is this land made for you and me?" And my favorite one goes like this: "As I went walking, I saw a sign there, and on the sign it said no trespassing, but on the other side, it didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me." Brilliant, right? I have to tell you, even though Francis Scott Key was one of the founders of the seminary I attended, there is a great big part of me that kind of wishes our national anthem were "This Land Is Your Land." Besides being, let's just admit it, a whole lot more singable, it just seems to contain so much more of the America I love, the broad and the beautiful parts, and the broken and the complicated parts as well. But here's the rub, and this is why I needed to tell you that Uncle Stuart was a respectable man of business. When Stuart sang the rest of that song one night with the down-home band of which he was a founding member, along with several of the nicest ex-hippies you'll ever meet, that night Stuart turned over to me and said, with a kind of affectionate sneer, "You do know Woody Guthrie was a communist, don't you, college boy?" I did not know this at the time, and I'll admit to finding it a little bit thrilling. I was a college boy, after all, and an English major at that. But it was also a little bit confusing to see that my uncle, committed capitalist that he was, also found this scandalous fact about Mr. Guthrie more enjoyable than problematic. He seemed to kind of like that these songs that arose from so deep a place within the American grain also contained these little landmines of contrary ways of seeing the world. Poignant challenges to any Pollyanna love of country that ignores where we fall short of our ideals. Now don't worry, this is not going to be the first Easter sermon in the history of Calvary Church to extol the virtues of communism. I'm still not a fan, Woody notwithstanding. But there really is something to be said for looking at the world from a radically different point of view now and then, isn't there? But on the other side, it didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me. Sometimes when you look at things from the other side of the sign, what you get is the whole rest of the world. And what I want to wonder with you this Easter day is whether the resurrection still has the power to spin us around, to change our perspective on things so completely that what it delivers to us is not just the salvation of our souls, but the restoration of our deepest and truest identities, our true place within God's beautiful and broken creation. It is surely the strangest ending of all the Gospels, what we just read from Mark, is it not? It's so strange that scholars tell us tidier endings were tacked on later, but in the earliest and most reliable manuscripts, the Gospel of Mark seems to have ended with what you just heard read. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were very afraid. That's it. End of the story. Resurrection looks like an empty tomb, a young man in a white robe insisting that Jesus has been raised, whatever that means. He tells the women to go back to Galilee and tell all the others what's happened. But all these most faithful friends of Jesus can do is turn on their heels and run away. The story ends with the two Marys and Salome fleeing, seized with terror and amazement, unable to speak of what they've seen. Who ends a story that way? Well, maybe someone who wants you to finish it, filled with that feeling of having your perspective so thoroughly spun around that you don't know what to say either. Because maybe you've never looked out at the world from the other side of this sign. A theologian named James Allison has a very striking way of talking about how the death and resurrection of Jesus reorients his followers. James Allison says that we human beings tend to construct our personalities, our identities in violent terms. He doesn't just mean we're always acting with violence, although it means just that far too often. What it means is that we understand ourselves in terms of when and where and over whom we can exercise control. Let me tell you who I am by telling you about where I'm powerful or influential or important. And I get that. Priests can construct identities in terms of power as well as anybody else. We have our own modes of violence even, I think. But the reversal Jesus worked in his disciples was to flip this perspective completely around. He taught them to take on the intelligence of the victim. That's Allison's term for it. Jesus wanted us to let go of defining ourselves according to what we can do and learn to see what in our souls would be left behind, even if we too were perfect victims. Even if we too controlled nothing of this world at all, if we had no power to do anything, who would we be? Or more to the gospel's point, if you were helpless as a man pinned to a cross, or even sealed up in a tomb, who would you be? Well, beloved. I think that's what Jesus would say. You'd be beloved. He'd say that because that's what he knew himself to be at his core. You see, Jesus' identity did not rest on any of the admittedly really cool things he did according to the gospel. It didn't rest on the miracles or the healings. It didn't rest on the elusive wisdom of his parables or his radical economics or strange ethics. It didn't even rest on his resurrection from the dead, not most fundamentally. Jesus' identity was rooted in his divine belovedness. It was established way back in the first moments of Mark at his baptism. Remember? When a voice from the heavens declared, "You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased." Belovedness is not something Jesus will achieve. It's not something that accumulates gradually in this story. Belovedness is chapter 1. Belovedness is the gift where everything in Jesus begins. And that must be why he went all the way to the tomb, if that's what it took, to free us from this oppressive notion that each of us is only worth whatever we can do for ourselves. This seems to be the lie that makes our world go round, but it's a lie just the same. Because who you are and what you are worth is based solely on the divine proclamation that you too are God's child, God's beloved. In you, in who you are at your core, God is pleased. Could we ever turn our perspectives fully enough around to believe this ridiculously good news? It may be the hardest thing of all to believe about ourselves. But maybe when we catch glimpses of belovedness in other people, it can become the most obvious thing in all the world. So if you'll indulge a personal story, I'll leave you with an image from my life of what I think I mean. Some of you genealogy experts will not be so shocked to hear that one of my Uncle Stuart's older sisters was my mother. Her name was Linda Loy Springfield. And she was homecoming queen and valedictorian of Siloam Springs High School class of 1958. Thank you very much. Siloam Springs, Arkansas was not exactly the epicenter of Western culture and power at the time. But still, to a lot of people of that time and place, having it all looked a whole lot like having what Mom had, right? And I'm telling you about what she had, so I can tell you about seeing that it was not who she was. You see, a couple of decades later, she was happily married and the mother of 2 very energetic boys when she began to experience dizzy spells and blurred vision. She was working in the library where Dad taught, and putting books up on those high shelves became a little treacherous. What we didn't know then was that the myelin sheaths around her nerves were beginning to deteriorate. Her nervous system was short-circuiting in the early stages of multiple sclerosis. Thanks be to God and medical research, many treatments exist today that weren't available to Mom as MS began this 35-year unraveling of her charmed bodily life. It took the strength from her legs and the coordination from her hands. It took away her touch at the piano, her elegant handwriting. In the end, it took much of her ability to see or to speak and the capacity of that brilliant mind to hold its thoughts together. Through it all, Dad took her everywhere. Plays, ball games, concerts, restaurants, lots of restaurants. In the last days of her life, Mennonites who owned the place up in Gentry, where chairs would be pulled away and a table would be set up week after week, year after year for her, they all came down to sing hymns to her. Their singing was clear in parts. They sang, "Come thou fount of every blessing." They sang, "Leaning on the everlasting arms." They sang, "Just a few more weary days, and then..." And why would I tell you of all this in an Easter sermon, if not just as a cheap tug at your heartstrings? Well, what I believe you'll understand is that no one who came to Mom's bedside to sing or tell stories or just sit came looking for a homecoming queen or the first in her class. Not even those who knew her when. They came, I believe, because sometimes when a body has nothing left to do in this world but die, the personalities and identities we spend so much time and care constructing for ourselves can finally fall mostly away. And the glowing belovedness that lives at the core of each one of us can come unbearably close to the surface. We look in on it and suddenly maybe we realize that we've been standing over here on the wrong side of this sign. So often I looked in on Mom and saw this innocent victim of a cruel disease. I thought it was all about the pain and the loss, while she looked up at me and her face seemed to say, "Don't be a fool, son, turn around. Can't you see the great big glorious world spread out behind you? It's actually enough just to sit here and take it in. The light from the window, those grandkids jumping all over the furniture, even the terrible puns this guy I married keeps telling me day after day. The gifts are everywhere. I think I could lie here and soak it in forever." Friends, I tell you all this not so you'll believe that my mother was beloved, but so you'll remember that you are. Whoever you are, whatever you've done or left undone, belovedness is what lives deepest down in all of us. It's where your story and my story begins to. Since Eden, we've been covering it up with layers of guilt and layers of shame, but I believe the resurrection of Jesus still has the power to turn us around. This perfect victim still has the power to renew our minds, as Paul would say. The power to expose the divine belovedness that burns at the core of each one of us. This is the redeeming gift of a resurrection perspective. Oh, and it does one more thing. As we get to turn away from the cramped little plots of our lives where we've posted our no trespassing sign, we also get to see that on the other side, it doesn't say nothing. We see that side, which is the entire rest of God's good and glorious creation, that side was made for you and me as well. Happy Easter, beloved friends. Happy Easter.